Okay, thank you. It's good to be in Helsinki on a warm morning. I did ask to mention the chemistry because what I'm going to tell you today is a bit of a journey. And it began when I went to Delft to study environmental science at the end of a PhD in chemistry, and ended up as a transport planner. Now, what happened was that the first thing I did was to buy a car, which you have to do if you're going to survive in the city, and I never used it in Delft. It took me a long time to realise I didn't actually need it, and there was a different kind of city that I was living in, and it was extraordinary to discover a walking city. And I've been in love with European cities ever since. I then went to Stanford and began studying ecology and discovered peak oil, because that was the year that OPEC first cut off the oil, and in San Francisco it was quite dramatic because the whole society began collapsing, people holding up service stations to get their last drop of oil. It was the first time we experienced oil shortage. And I began to think, why is this city different to the city in Delft where I had just come from? And began the whole process of collecting data on cities. And this was our first book, Cities and Automobile Dependence, where we defined that term, and it's used in planning all the time now. But basically it was my experience that I grew up in a car-dependent city. I thought every city was like that, but they're not. And fortunately, some are not. And I was living in one when it was quite clear it's very vulnerable. So we began this data collection, and you can see here is Helsinki, about 15 gigajoules per person, compared to Atlanta with 103 gigajoules per person, and lower per capita wealth level. The other arrows are there to show that there is something different about this group of cities out here, and then this group, and then this group, which has virtually nothing. Barcelona here is 8 gigajoules per capita, and Krakow about 4, and all of these emerging cities of China and India with about 2. And the densities similarly scattered around. Helsinki is in fact quite a low density European city, but this group of European cities in the middle, the cities with very low levels of fuel use, very high density, places like Ho Chi Minh City and Mumbai and so on. And then the cities of the New World, which are less than 20 people per hectare, and Atlanta down here at 6 people per hectare. It's almost not a city. And the first time we put this into a graphical form and showed this exponential relationship where, again, there seems to be a group of cities there, one in the middle, particularly the European cities here, and then these very low-level cities here. So we proceeded in this kind of work, and this book, Sustainability of Cities, came out in 1999 and extended further and tried to help understand this in terms of the 3 city types. What we found is that within a city, and this is Melbourne and Sydney combined in their local governments by transport, energy and density, and you can see here this is Sydney, the city of Sydney here, which is very dense, and some of the other parts of Melbourne and Sydney are quite dense, but mostly the new outer suburban areas are very high in car use and low density. And these relationships are very clearly not related to wealth. So the wealthy live in the core and inner areas of Melbourne, for example, and they walk and bike and use public transport considerably more than the poorer outer suburbs. So it isn't a wealth-related thing, despite the fact that most transport models assume that as income rises, car use rises with it, and I'll come back to that. In Sydney, this vampire map, as it's called, shows the blue inner core here, which has where the wealthy mostly live, and they use cars 10 times less than those far outer suburban areas in the red. And in between, along the corridors, about half that car use. And you can see why the politics at the moment is that these areas, the northwest and the southwest, desperately looking for new rail systems, because that's where the railways go, down those corridors. And in fact, most of the recent elections in Australia have been about that kind of issue. So perhaps there are three city types, and the development of a model began in our minds, and we looked to understand it and discovered Thomas Marchetti, the physicist, who looked at cities and found the same travel time budget in every city. And in history, the UK shows that it goes back 600 years at least, that the average travel time budget is around about an hour. And this means that cities are 1 hour wide. And the traditional walking city, which you can walk across in 5 kilometres, or it's 5 kilometres across, and you can walk across it in an hour. It's high density and mixed and organic, and it existed for the last few thousand years, and some of them are still around. The interesting thing is that these squatter settlements, when they grow organically, they're very like the old walking cities. Narrow streets, quite dense, pre-industrial. This is Shaban and Yemen, a mud brick Manhattan, which you can see a tiny little corner there with a few cars in it, but it's essentially the old walking city. And of course the walking cities in the centre of all European cities, which are still functioning well because of their walkability. This is Wall Street in Manhattan. It's a walking city. And of course Tokyo, which is an extraordinary centre based on enormous numbers of pedestrians. The Chinese cities are mostly walking and biking cities and have now been dramatically changing. I've just come from India, and you can find the old walking cities still there. Then in the 19th century, the industrial cities began to be impossible to squeeze into the walking cities, and they began to take them apart and to build sewage systems and transit systems. And the cities began to follow the tram lines and the train lines. Firstly, the steam train lines would spread the city in corridors, and the tram lines into a larger kind of walking city. So the transit city could now go out 20 to 30 kilometres. You could go across that city in 1 hour, and they could reduce their densities, but they're still around the 50 to 100 per hectare. This is Melbourne, showing the tram city fabric along Sydney Road, which is a classic example of that kind of corridor. Trams tend to follow those long lines of development. Trains have their string of pearls stations. This is Stockholm, showing its central, one of the sub-centres built around an integrated bus rail centre. Vancouver, following the SkyTrain, and several of these new sub-centres being built along that, so that it's not just the city centre, which is a very walkable centre, but a transit city area as well. And many European cities putting in light rail, developing new corridors. This is looking down on Tokyo. You can see the zigzag there of the high-rise buildings following their subways, and a very clear sense of where the transit city feeds through the city. Then, I don't know what happened then, but the automobile cities began in the 50s and 60s as cars became available and we could spread the city out in all directions. And we can now go out about 50 kilometres and still be across the city in an hour. The infrastructure of highways, dispersed housing and the cultural values of suburbia seem to go together. And every city has been shaped in some way by that priority. This is a pamphlet that came from the Pure Oil and a set of tyre companies and so on, about the new American frontier, where it went from the walking city, which congested, up into the transit city, into the new form of city based around the car. This is from 1950, and of course they did it. And this is the Century Freeway in Los Angeles, and in Chicago, looking down, there's very substantial amounts of automobile infrastructure, and some fairly amazing pieces of archaeological evidence in the future for what we've done. And this is the new frontier, with the looking out the window on a freeway with the good wife and child and the pipe in hand. So the automobile city is with us, and it has extended the city out so that we go from the walking city, the transit city, and now the car-based city. And of course the American, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian cities did this far more, but European cities are clearly in the grip of that same issue of the priorities in transport. So these kind of suburbs grew with the car and are totally dependent on the car, as are the shopping centres that are totally car-based. The American cities certainly went the furthest, and where national city lines removed the transit in one night in 44 cities, American cities have been struggling ever since to rebuild their public transport system. Every one of those cities trying desperately to build light rail now back in along those same lines they took it out from. So the problem was that town planning then adopted the car-based city as the model, neglecting the other types of cities and treating them as though they didn't exist. So the theory of urban fabrics, which we have been developing, I didn't realise I had a theory, I just thought it was obvious. But the theory is that there is a combination of walking city, transit city and automobile city fabrics in every city. There are 3 cities, not 1 city. And the elements of this, of the fabric, consist of differences in density, and mix and road width and setbacks and infrastructure that supports the modes. Parking levels, stations, pedestrian and cycling spaces, and so on. And so understanding this helps us to manage the city. What we're suggesting is that the 3 R's, we need to recognise the 3 city types. Where are they in the city? Respect the different functionality of those 3 city types, and then repair and regenerate them in their own way, with their own rules. And the priorities are defined by the outcomes that each can give. So if we want sustainability, then we need to see the qualities of the walking and transit cities. There is not 1 city, but 3. So in fact, we have cities that are predominantly automobile cities with little scraps of walking and transit city left, and some with more. Then the transit cities of Europe, which have a combination of the 3, but substantially more of the walking and transit city than American cities. And the walking city, particularly the emerging cities of Asia, which are in fact being built as walking cities because of their density and mix. They don't just very often consider the pedestrian. And it's the same within the city, and it's about 35 people per hectare is the minimum that we see defined as the base, beyond which you must have a car to survive. Then 35 to 100 people per hectare, the transit city area, and over 100 the walking city area. We found after a while that this historical approach linked into wave and innovation theory, and that's the basis of our book on resilient cities, that these different eras of economic waves, which are leading now into the next wave of the green economy, are associated with different forms of transport in a city form. That the walking cities here and in the first wave were then part of the next wave with the steam train coming, and then the electric train and tram in this era, the third one. The fourth era is the one we've just been through, which is dominated by the car and cheap oil, the truck and the plane. The superhighway has come in, and now we're not quite sure, but somewhere in there we've got to have a lot more electric, renewable gas, and a lot more pedestrian focus. Now the story switches. Leo dropped out of the sky. As far as I was concerned, I didn't know he'd been working on this stuff for years in practice and using our work, and said he'd like to come and work with us in Fremantle, and he did. And we've been working together since to develop the theory of urban fabrics, and Leo will talk more about this in detail straight after me. And he will emphasise the fact that there was a paradigm shift in 1933 when the idea of the functional city and modernism and the automobile city thinking became the one city that we were all moving towards, with a one set of rules and a manual that the traffic engineers took and used to build cities, and that this essentially left out the other two kinds of cities. So what it means in practice is, firstly, the recognition, the recognise. We need to do all of that amazing work that people are now doing, and there's even a cost workshop on accessibility instruments, which means mapping and enabling us to see the patterns of transport within different areas. So you can now see, this is a map of Sydney showing where the walkable catchments along train lines are. The vast areas outside of that, the car-based city. These are the old tram lines, which are very different in their fabric and different in their car use patterns. And some of the new bus routes that fit in with that as well. Sydney again showing these patterns. This sort of mapping is essential for us to recognise the three city types. Now we've been using Snammets, which was developed by Jan Scherer and Kerry Curtis, who's part of the cost group. And Snammets is a way of measuring accessibility. Now this area here has no rail line to it. This is Melbourne. Doncaster was promised a rail in 1890, first of all, and has been promised it in most elections since. Every time they come to look at it, they can't quite do it. So we had a look to see what would be the accessibility changes. Now, the black areas are essentially the car-dependent ones because they have very little access to public transport. The green areas are those places where you really can live without a car. Now, if you build the railway along that dotted line there, you come up and you can show that corridor will emerge and have significant accessibility benefits. Now, why we did that was because we came up with a financing plan to show how the increase in land values associated with that accessibility can be used to fund the rail. And that's now a major agenda in all Australian cities. We are seriously looking at value capture, the American tax increment financing mechanism, but you've got to be able to know where they will benefit. you're creating transit city fabric here. That fabric will go up in value considerably. And you can then tap that in the tax system in order to finance it. Respect is a matter of understanding the urban fabric and seeing how it works and how it needs to be planned. So the walking city fabric needs dense, mixed land use zonings, zero setbacks, narrow streets. The traffic engineers love to widen those streets. They're not, the level of service is too low. No, it's perfect for a pedestrian. That's what it's designed for. And so you need this pedestrian priority and infrastructure, plus cycling, and for example, zero or minimal parking, because that's the fabric. The transit city fabric needs medium density, some mix in a string of corridor centres. Minimal setbacks, walking city fabric in the centres that are created, with transit priority and infrastructure, e.g. minimal parking. Different sets of rules for the different city types, not the one manual for everything. And the automobile infrastructure needs low density, low mix, large setbacks, space for the car and truck storage and management, car and truck priority only in those areas, and truck routes and freeways are what are needed for that kind of land use and that kind of fabric. And they are needed in a city, just not the whole city. So this kind of fabric is not designed for that many cars. It is designed for those 3 buses or that 1 light rail. Repair and regenerate then can follow to enable them to work more effectively in their walking, transit and car-based functions, and clearly within a sustainability framework. Now this freeway was built through the middle of Seoul as a way to generate a level of service that is required, and the only bit of space that they could put it in was over a river. It happened to be a sacred river, which they destroyed, and it was very unpopular. So about 8 years ago, a group got together and lobbied to take it down. And one of the candidates for mayor put his hand up and said, yes, I'll take it down. He happened to be the head of the Hyundai Corporation that had built the freeway. He got elected. You can imagine him walking into the traffic engineering department saying, okay, bring it down. And they did, and restored a 10-kilometre long patch of river and made a walkable and transit-oriented centre. It's absolutely beautiful, extraordinary piece of infrastructure, and clearly works. The car levels disappeared, as they do, and the mayor was then elected president. It doesn't hurt the politics to get the theory of urban fabrics right. Shanghai is another story along this line. In 1990 on the left, 2010 here, extraordinary change in the city. Far denser, far more mixed, far more walking oriented in fact. But they started building freeways in the American model. And it didn't work. Clearly, they had to do something else. The cities, and many cities in Asia are like this, you know them. So they built the metro. In 10 years, they built the biggest metro in the world. 420 kilometres of rail line, and it carries 8 million people a day. So they are restoring the walking and transit city characteristics. They are building for the first time. In fact, they're transit corridors, and they are doing it very easily and very quickly because the fabric is already there in reality. And this is the story of the emerging cities. They will never become like American cities with the massive car use that they have. The fabric is not going to allow it. They're already full of cars. You can't get another one in there at peak time. So their agenda is shifting. Young girl has been working in most of the major cities. He's from Copenhagen, of course, and the transformation of Broadway is a classic example of restoring the walkable city functions of that area, taking out those cars and making it so much more attractive. Nobody's going to go back now. They see the way it really works. Melbourne is a city he worked in over 10 years. From 1994 he did the first report, and in 2004 he came back and said, well, how much more walkable is Melbourne? So he collected data on it. And this street, for example, the cars were taken out of, but there were a lot more people living in the downtown area. All kinds of streets were greened with street trees. Outdoor cafes took off, and the laneways became amazingly attractive places. That's the walkable city coming back to life. His whole approach is to respect the walkable city and to rebuild it and regenerate it. So the data on that shows large increases in pedestrian traffic and activities within the city based on walking. So what do you do about the automobile city? You will have noticed that I'm saying we should respect the automobile city, which I've not done a lot of in my past. I've been trying to fight it. But essentially, you do have to see that it has a role and a place in our cities and needs to be respected. Now, part of in Perth we've had something like 20 odd new urbanist experiments. Peter Calthorpe and Peter Katz and Dwayne all came out and built a new suburb which was going to transform the way people lived without cars. Now the thing about new urbanism is it's got a few bits of transit city fabric, but not much. And they didn't work. They all failed. So the data we collected, we did a PhD, and then they're all car-based. And there's a tiny bit more walking. They're permeable. They've got straight streets, and they've got sidewalks, footpaths. But in fact, even with permeable streets and footpaths, the car remains king. So it's not enough transit city fabric to get people out of their cars. So can you do anything? Let me tell you this story. That's me in 1979 when the city lost its railway. And I was a city councillor at the time. This did offend me. And we started the Friends of the Railways, and every time we've had an election since, we built a new piece of railway. So we now have the traditional rail lines back and running, electrified and very functional. This is the transit city fabric, the old one. But we've extended into the north and into the south, deep into automobile city territory, where trains should not go, according to the transport planners. They shouldn't work. There isn't the fabric for it. And in my theory, it's probably true too. But in fact, the Southern Rail has worked brilliantly. The 78,000 passengers a day it's carrying now after a few years of running. 14,000 were carried on the buses, which had a BRT at one point. 16% growth per annum in the last few years. It goes down the middle of a freeway, very fast. It was cheap, and it carries now the equivalent of 8 lanes of traffic. You couldn't possibly build that, 8 lanes of traffic at that kind of cost. So this is Adelaide, which has done very little building of its public transport system. This is the Northern Line, the Southern Line. If you build it, they will come. And how is that we have an integrated approach. So instead of people walking to the train station, they're brought by bus in a very integrated way. So they come along those crossovers and go down the elevators down to from the bus and onto the train with an integrated ticketing system. And it's very quick, very easy exchange, very little transfer loss. The question then is, is this just automobile city fabric with a train in it? It largely is, but what is happening is that the system as a whole is attracting development around it of a transit city form. So in the city centre, the whole of the city is moving now around the railway station. We have a new station here at the Esplanade station. That old bit of automobile city fabric was taken down once the train was built, and a whole new area of the city being built. Now, we couldn't have done that if you'd had that freeway there. You could only do it based around a train. And we are now developing sub-centres. This is one new one, 33 kilometres out, built around the train station. And we've recently done the data to show that the value of the land around that southern railway has gone up 42% in 5 years. Even before the railway was built, it started going up. So this will mean more and more land development will occur around those stations, and we will begin that transit city fabric being built. So this kind of centre is what's emerging. Now that isn't huge still, it's a small amount, but it is a way of showing that you can rebuild some transit city fabric into the automobile city. We have a plan for how the rail can be extended into an orbital system, a bit like Helsinki's plan, and that the next 30 years of growth could be accommodated in those areas. Now, I just want to finish by talking about what's happening around the world. There is an amazing new demand for walking and transit city fabric. We, in our data, found that there was a declining car use growth, and we didn't predict that it would go negative, but it has. In all the developed cities, car use per capita is going down. Per capita car use for 100 years grew and is now going down. Every Australian city, per capita car use peaked in 2004, same year as in America. And even in small cities like Canberra and Hobart. So it's not congestion doing it. And quite substantial declines. Public transport is part of the explanation. This is Melbourne, this is Perth, where the growth, where serious building of infrastructure has occurred, and the other cities are essentially the same. But around the world, what we're picking up is public transport growth is substantially outstripping car use. The red being the most recent data, and it is clear that public transport is no longer the welfare systems that people thought of it as. It is growing enormously. And particularly in the emerging world. So 82 Chinese cities want to do what Shanghai has done. That's where their growth is now being directed. 16 Indian cities are building metros. And all the Middle Eastern cities, all the oil-producing cities of the world are building electric rail. They must know something. Global demand, therefore, is now, I think, for walking city and transit city fabric with less automobile city fabric. Why is this, and why will it continue? Firstly, the price of oil is mostly predicted to keep going up. Density is now going up. Again, 100 years of decline in densities are reversing. So the data, for example, in Melbourne, you can see it went from 14.9 up to 15.6, which is not a huge increase, but it is going up. Sydney, for example, in the centre has grown 15%, in the middle suburbs 11%, far out of Sydney 6.5%. That's a big change. People are not going out to the suburbs, they're coming back in. The third thing is cultural change. If you look at the American data, the people who are getting out of cars are the young, in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, less car use per capita. Then you get to us baby boomers out here, and we're still driving further. We're going to drive to our graves, I reckon, but we are disappearing, and the young are taking over, and they have a different culture. If you go on any train or bus, they're all on their phones and tablets, and that is the way they are finding their freedom and connection, in the same way that us baby boomers found freedom and connection in a car. And you can use your new devices in a train or a tram or a bus a lot easier than in a car, especially if you're driving. In fact, it's now illegal in most places. So there is a movement to say, let's stop this growth in automobile city infrastructure and traffic, and that there is a different kind of city emerging. And particularly so amongst the young and rich in America. So a 23% decline in car use in the 16 to 34-year-old bracket, way beyond anything I would have predicted. They are moving into other modes, but they are moving back into the city, into the walking and transit city fabric where they don't need a car. That's the demand. In central London, 19% decline in traffic in the past decade, where cafe culture replaces car culture. That's in the Times. And it does seem to be that financial centres are showing the way, because they are the ones reducing car use most quickly. Now, we've got a whole lot of stuff on the economics. I'll just show you one graph. Jeff Kenworthy's latest data shows that passenger car use per capita compared to GDP per capita is going down. So we are getting wealthier and we're using cars less. That does mean that the traditional four-step model for predicting transport, which links income with car use, is wrong. And we need to get a different set of tools. So there is a new urban form emerging. I think it is more like this, with centres and sub-centres and ring rails, and that we can rebuild that automobile city. You can't just tear it down. It's going to be there, but it needs support. Now, all cities have these three city fabrics. I'm just going to show you a little bit of India, where I've just come from, the old walking city of Delhi and Pune, but so many of the roads, there's one pedestrian trying desperately to get across it. So we had a project to try and help rebuild the street structure in Pune to support the walking city, and it certainly does need it. We have got a lot of support from the authorities to do that. In Old Jaipur, which is a beautiful city, nearly 300 years old, built like this, the streets were built for people and are used by pedestrians and hawkers and so on, and most extraordinary looking place. Then you go to New Jaipur, which looks like Canberra or any of the new car-based cities. Big, spatial road widths and lots of cars and trucks. That's the only pedestrian I noticed. And there were a few freight carrying women. The transit fabric is alive and well in these Indian cities, based mostly on buses, and which is why they're now building metros that are substantially faster and more with higher capacity. And they're certainly very popular. And they have the advantage of the last mile, the link between that and a broader accessibility area because of their auto rituals. Helsinki. You can look down on the old walking city, alive and well, lots of pedestrians, and very beautiful areas that are now recognised and respected. And even rebuilding some of the original walking fabric back into areas like this, next to the old car park, which is being transformed, and this car park being transformed is very symbolic, I think, of the change of direction and you were building new walking city fabric all around that within a close distance to the city centre. The old transit fabric is alive and well. I went to Pikiloppalahti to see the new transit city fabric, which is being built. It's an extraordinary place, I think, as an example of how you can continue to build transit city fabric with narrow streets and mixed use. But you do certainly have automobile city fabric, plenty of it, and you try to have some transit down it, which is good, and you have some density out there, but often it is not working because it doesn't have the full transit city fabric, even if you hide it in the forest. And provide it with big pedestrian and cycleways. So reclaiming the automobile city fabric is the theme of your new town plan, and this kind of thing is a pretty extraordinary effort if you can pull it off. If you can do this, the Helsinki model will become well known. Let me say one final thing, because respecting and regenerating walking city and transit city is not necessarily meaning less nature. There are ways of incorporating nature in the city. We've done a film on Singapore, which is a very dense city and has this new biophilic urbanism built into the fabric of the city, and I think that is a part of the new sustainable city as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for a great address, great speech. We could allow a couple of questions just before Leo takes the stage. Any reflections from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, Anders Jansson, Finnish Traffic Agency. You are talking about the Helsinki experience, or what we call it. At the same time as Helsinki city planners are developing different kinds of transit city, walking cities, at the same time there are still hundreds of parking spaces being built under central Helsinki. At the same time there are two big city car route tunnel projects that are always pop up, the so-called Central Tunnel and another one, the so-called Pasila Norsi or whatever, which intend to transport lots of cars from one end of Helsinki center to the other. I don't know why, but still we are planning them. But do you feel that the same kind of schizophrenia, for instance in Perth, Vancouver, is still very much on the agenda, and it's very much a question of throwing a coin, what do you get, heads or tails?
Yes, it is a schizophrenia, and it's alive and well in all cities. The only value that I can see in it is that you can see how much money could be going into these other forms and how much more effective it would be. It's extraordinarily expensive now building automobile infrastructure, isn't it? Those underground parking and tunnels are so expensive, and yet we're still doing it. So when we do finally wake up, if we keep the same budgets, there's plenty of money to fix the cities. That's about the only hopeful thing I can see in it, because I think we will look back and see it as huge opportunities lost. At a time when our cities are growing and the economies are growing, we should be putting this money into more sustainable transport systems, because we have to change, and all of the demand, all of the economics show that we are going the wrong way if we are focusing on cars still. And it's just a matter of us waking up. It is a political situation, and politics is always going to be subject to the lobbies of different groups, and car users have been very effective at that lobbying for some time, and we'll continue to do that. We have a new Prime Minister in Australia who has essentially said, I'm not going to put a cent into urban rail after having 6 years of most of our infrastructure funding going into new rail systems, because the benefit cost ratios were clearly better. And now he said, no, people won't. You'll never get people out of their cars. He's also taken out the carbon tax, which we had in place. So he's really leading us into the future.
Okay, so we have challenges from getting from schizophrenic cities to sustainable, sane cities.
Yeah,
we have 2 more questions. One first here and then here.
And we just launched a Wiki City program for Finland. This is maybe something for a platform. My question actually is that when you said that young people say that cars are so yesterday, is it some kind of a trend from car addiction to a phone addiction with internet, Google and Facebook, that you can't really go to the internet when you drive a car? And how would you then see the development towards electric cars that are self-driven? Is that going to change the picture, or is it going to be part of the car city in the future? And is it sustainable or not?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that it's Google leading the way to try and show how you can get these driverless cars. Why? You can get onto their system. It's a lot easier if you don't have to drive. It's an hour a day extra that they can take their clients. And look, I do think there is something in that. And electric cars are going to be part of automobile city fabric. I just don't see them as necessary in the walking and transit city fabric, just supportive maybe. Certainly we can get electric buses as well as electric trains. Before we would want to have driverless electric cars going around everywhere. Just at least gets electric buses onto the roads. There are a lot of sensible things we can do before we need to go to the crazy things like driverless cars.
Yes, thank you. I'm Eva Fuhrman from Syke. I thought it was really interesting, and I also picked that as a special thing when you brought this connection from the used to the new mobile electronics. But my question is that now when we are having this change, we are talking very much about moving people from one place to the other, or how people move. But cities are not self-sufficient. We import lots of goods and we export lots of waste. And how is that so now when you have this new transition to these new models of transport and form?
Yeah, that's a whole other lecture. And the theory of urban fabrics is just in parallel to that. It's not the whole thing about city sustainability. We have to deal with energy, water, waste, materials, and the urban metabolism model that is part of our Sustainable Cities book that we wrote in the 90s is clearly part of that agenda. There is a race on as to who can best do that. The Germans, most European cities are doing a lot more in this than other places and are getting the edge in terms of the green economy and showing the technologies that are now available, so automated waste systems and so on. They've come from Europe. America used to be the leader in this kind of technology, and in the 80s they gave up on it when Reagan actually removed the members of the American delegation to the Brundtland Commission and banned the word sustainable development from all government activity. It essentially set them back decades. And from the top of the 60s, when all environmental technologies were American, it's shifted now and Europe is the leader. And I see this urban metabolism concept and how to minimise waste, and then even go to the extent of a regenerative city where we are actually able to restore and regenerate areas around in our bioregion, waterways, our air systems, climates, that we could actually be contributing, not consuming the earth. And that is essentially going to be, I think, European leadership that gets us there. So all power to Syke to lead the way in this new technology that's desperately needed.
Thank you once more, Peter. Let's give Peter a hand.